The judge thought he could shatter Karoline Leavitt's spirit with a single caustic remark, but in an instant it was he who stood trembling, wrists bound in steel, his gavel silenced before the world. The courtroom in Washington, D.C. buzzed with a restless energy, a low hum of whispers threading through the air like a current ready to spark. Rows of onlookers leaned forward, their breaths held, eyes darting between the young woman at the plaintiff's table and the towering figure behind the bench. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning, a clash of wills that would ripple far beyond these walls. And at its heart stood Karoline Leavitt, unbowed, her presence a quiet storm amid the chaos. She was no stranger to scrutiny, this 28-year-old White House press secretary, whose youth belied a ferocity few could match. Today, though, the stakes were higher than any press briefing or political firestorm she'd faced. She carried a mantle heavier than titles, a mission to shield the trust of a nation too long betrayed by those sworn to uphold it. Her hands rested on a stack of documents, each page a weapon forged in truth, her gaze steady as she faced the man who thought he could dismiss her. Judge Leonard Grayson loomed over the proceedings, his voice a low growl that seemed to shake the very air, his authority etched into every line of his weathered face. He'd built a reputation as a titan of the law, a gatekeeper of justice. Or so the story went. But beneath his robe, something darker festered, and Karoline knew it. "Miss Leavitt," Grayson began, his tone laced with a condescension that cut like a blade, "do you truly believe someone of your limited experience belongs in a courtroom of this magnitude? This isn't a podium for grandstanding, it's a place for facts." His words landed like a gauntlet thrown, a challenge meant to rattle her, to reduce her to a footnote in his domain. The room stilled, a collective inhale as if the walls themselves waited for her to falter. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, a flicker of triumph he couldn't quite hide. But Karoline didn't flinch. She lifted her chin, her eyes locking with his, and in that moment the weight of a promise burned within her, a vow whispered years ago to a father now gone. "I'll fight for what's right, Dad, no matter who stands in my way." That promise wasn't just words, it was the fire in her veins, the anchor that held her steady now. Her mother's quiet strength lingered in her too, a silent force she'd yet to fully understand. She drew a breath, her voice rising clear and unshaken, slicing through the tension like a beacon piercing fog. "Your Honor, I'm here not to perform but to unveil a truth this court and this country deserves to see." Her fingers brushed the topmost file, a silent vow to the man who'd taught her courage, the man whose memory fueled her every step. Grayson's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of unease he masked with a dismissive wave. "Proceed, then," he said, his tone a grudging concession, "but I expect substance, not theatrics." The crowd shifted, a murmur rippling through them, and among them sat a cluster of law students from Georgetown, their notebooks open, their eyes wide with something more than academic interest. They weren't just here to learn, they were here to witness, to carry this moment forward, a new generation hungry for a justice that didn't bend to power. Karoline opened her file, her movements deliberate, each motion a testament to the resolve that had brought her here. She didn't need to shout, her presence spoke louder than words. But as she began, Grayson's interruptions came swift and sharp, his voice booming over hers like thunder rolling over a fragile dawn. "I've seen these games before, Miss Leavitt. Evidence must stand, not stumble." His gaze bore into her, a test of will, a dare to break, yet she stood taller, her response a quiet thunder of its own. "And it will stand, Your Honor. It'll stand so firmly you'll feel its weight." The students scribbled furiously, their pens racing to capture the defiance in her tone, the spark of something unstoppable igniting before them. Then came the moment no one saw coming. The double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open, a sound like a gunshot cracking through the silence. Pam Bondi strode in, her presence a force of nature, her sharp suit a contrast to the chaos she commanded. Behind her, 2 federal agents flanked her steps, their faces carved from stone, handcuffs glinting in their hands. The room erupted in gasps, heads whipping around, but Bondi's eyes fixed on Grayson alone. "Judge Leonard Grayson," she declared, her voice a blade of ice and steel, "by the authority of the United States Attorney General, you're under arrest for obstructing justice and conspiring to defraud the American people." The gavel slipped from Grayson's grasp, clattering uselessly to the bench as the agents closed in. Karoline stood still, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a fierce, radiant hope. The students rose to their feet, their cheers a raw, unscripted hymn to a future they could believe in, and in that instant, the world shifted, because the man who'd mocked her was now the one in chains, and Karoline Leavitt had just begun to fight. Karoline Leavitt squared her shoulders, her voice cutting through the courtroom's stifling air as she launched into the heart of her case. Ethan Blackwell stands accused of siphoning $7 million of public funds into ghost projects, shells that built nothing but his own fortune. Her words landed like a hammer, deliberate and unyielding, aimed straight at the man seated at the defendant's table. Blackwell leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a smug grin, his tailored suit a silent boast of untouchability. He didn't just believe he'd walk free, he was certain of it. His confidence rooted in the man looming behind the bench, Judge Leonard Grayson. The older man's presence was a wall of authority, his voice a low growl that rolled over the room like distant thunder, heavy with the weight of decades spent bending the law to his will. Grayson's eyes narrowed as Karoline spoke, and he didn't wait long to strike. "Miss Leavitt," he interrupted, his tone dripping with disdain, "are you suggesting this court should take your word over a man who's built half this city? I'd advise you to temper your accusations, or do you think your little press conferences qualify you for this?" The jab was sharp, meant to sting, to paint her as an upstart playing out of her league. Blackwell's smirk widened, his fingers drumming lightly on the table, a rhythm of arrogance that echoed Grayson's challenge. But Karoline didn't blink. She met Grayson's gaze head-on, her voice steady as steel. "I'm not here to trade credentials, Your Honor. I'm here with evidence. Hard numbers and harder truths. Blackwell's empire isn't built on concrete, it's built on theft." She slid a stack of bank receipts across the table, her fingers tapping the top sheet. "Exhibit A, a transfer of $4 million from a city housing fund to a company that doesn't exist. No offices, no employees, just a bank account with Blackwell's name on it." The room shifted, a ripple of murmurs from the jury, but Grayson cut in before it could settle. "Numbers on a page mean nothing without context, Miss Leavitt," he snapped, leaning forward, his knuckles whitening against the bench. "You think you can dazzle us with paperwork? I've seen better from first-year law clerks." His voice boomed, a deliberate attempt to drown her out, to reassert his grip on the proceedings. Blackwell chuckled softly, a sound that grated like sandpaper, his eyes glinting with the certainty of a man who'd never lost. Karoline's jaw tightened, but her resolve didn't waver. "Then let's add context," she fired back, her tone rising just enough to match his. "These aren't random digits. They're the lifeblood of families who trusted this system, stolen by a man who thinks he's above it." She turned to a sleek, interactive board beside her, a tool she'd insisted on bringing into this old-school courtroom. With a flick of her hand, a digital flowchart flared to life, tracing the money's path in vivid red lines. Public coffers to Blackwell's private accounts. The jury leaned in, eyes widening as the web of deceit unfolded before them. "This isn't speculation," she said, pointing to a highlighted email. "It's Blackwell's own words, ordering his CFO to bury the trail." Grayson's face darkened, unease cracking his steely facade. "Enough with the theatrics," he barked, his voice a whip crack. "You're wasting this court's time with gadgets and guesswork. Prove it's not fabricated or sit down." The challenge hung heavy, a gauntlet thrown to trip her up. Blackwell nodded approvingly, his grin now a full-fledged sneer, as if the judge had just handed him the keys to freedom. But Karoline wasn't done. She pulled out another file, her movements calm but electric with purpose. "Fabricated?" she countered, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Then explain why your signature's on the approval, Your Honor. A ghost project greenlit under your watch." The room froze, the accusation a live wire sparking in the silence. Grayson's eyes widened for a split second before narrowing again, his composure fraying. "You're treading dangerous ground, young lady," he growled, his voice low and venomous. "I won't have my court turned into a circus by some reckless child." The insult was a desperate swing, but Karoline didn't flinch. I'm not the one juggling lies, she shot back, her gaze unflinching. The circus started when you let Blackwell rob the public blind. And I've got the receipts to prove it. Before Grayson could retort, a new voice broke through, a trembling tenor from the witness stand. Daniel Pierce, a former Blackwell employee, stood pale and shaking, his hands clasped tight. "He threatened me," Pierce said, his words spilling out like a dam breaking. "Told me to shred the records or I'd lose everything, my job, my family. I stayed quiet too long, but I can't anymore." His confession hit like a thunderclap, the raw fear in his eyes a mirror to the cost of truth. Blackwell's smirk vanished, his hands clenching into fists while Grayson's face twitched, a crack in his armor he couldn't hide. Karoline seized the moment, turning back to the board. "Pierce isn't alone," she said, her voice rising with a fierce clarity. "There are dozens like him, silenced, scared, but not anymore. This chart doesn't just show money, it shows lives ruined, trust broken, all under your nose, Your Honor." She faced Grayson directly, her words a blade aimed at his core. "You want substance? Here it is. $7 million. 7 betrayals, and one man who thought he could buy his way out." Blackwell shifted in his seat, his bravado crumbling, while Grayson slammed his gavel down, the sound hollow against her momentum. "Order!" he roared, but his voice cracked, a king losing his crown. "You'll regret this, Leavitt." "Will I?" she replied, her tone icy with defiance. "Or will you?" The jury sat riveted, their faces a mix of shock and fury, while the law students in the back scribbled furiously, their pens racing to capture a fight they'd never forget. Blackwell's empire was teetering, Grayson's grip slipping, and Karoline Leavitt stood at the center, her courage a beacon burning through the shadows of corruption. The battle was far from over, but she'd just drawn first blood, and the taste of justice was sharp on her tongue. Karoline Leavitt stood at the plaintiff's table, her heart a steady drumbeat against the storm brewing in the courtroom. She reached into her briefcase, her fingers closing around a battered folder, the kind of evidence that carried the weight of betrayal in its crumpled edges. "Your Honor," she said, her voice a clear, resonant thread pulling the room taut, "I present a contract, unearthed from Ethan Blackwell's personal safe, authorizing a $4 million transfer to a non-existent contractor." She held it aloft, the paper trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the gravity of what it revealed. "And here, in black ink, is your signature, Judge Grayson. Proof you didn't just oversee this theft, you enabled it." The courtroom inhaled as one, a sharp collective gasp slicing through the silence. Grayson's face hardened, but his eyes betrayed him, a flicker of panic darting beneath the mask of authority. He leaned forward, his voice a gravelly snarl, though it wavered at the edges. "That's preposterous, Miss Leavitt. You dare accuse me with some tattered scrap? I deny it, categorically. This is a fabrication, and I'll see you sanctioned for this outrage." His denial was fierce, a lion's roar. But the tremble in his tone was a crack in the facade, and the jury noticed. A woman in the front row, a single mother with tired eyes and calloused hands, clenched her fists, her mind flashing to the years she'd scraped by while her taxes vanished into Blackwell's pockets. Karoline didn't retreat. She stepped closer to the bench, her gaze locked on Grayson's, her words a quiet fire. "Fabrication? Then explain why your handwriting matches the memo attached, a note instructing Blackwell to keep this quiet or we're both finished." "This isn't a scrap, it's a confession." She set the documents down with a deliberate thud, the sound echoing like a judge's gavel in reverse. A verdict against the man who wielded it. Grayson's hands gripped the bench, his knuckles whitening, and he shot back, his voice rising in a desperate bid to reclaim control. "You're out of line, Leavitt. This court won't tolerate baseless slander from a novice who doesn't know her place. Withdraw that, now, or I'll hold you in contempt." The threat hung heavy, a sword poised to fall, but Karoline stood taller, her defiance a shield forged in purpose. "My place," she said, her voice cutting through his bluster, "is to speak for the people you've failed. Contempt? The only contempt here is yours, for the law you swore to uphold." The jury shifted, their eyes darting between the two, the air thick with the scent of a turning tide. Then a faint buzz broke the standoff. Karoline's phone vibrating in her pocket, she glanced down, her pulse quickening as a text from Mia Torres. an investigative journalist with a knack for unearthing buried truths, flashed across the screen. Grayson was probed in mid-9, bribery, cleared by connected friends, dig deeper. The message was a lifeline, a spark igniting her next move. She looked up, her resolve sharpening into a blade. Your Honor, you've dodged accountability before. Internal reviews swept under the rug by powerful allies. Not today. I move that this trial be broadcast live on the screens outside this courthouse so the public can see every word, every lie, for themselves. The room erupted, gasps and murmurs swelling into a wave. Grayson slammed his gavel, the crack a futile plea for order. Absurd, he bellowed, his face flushing red. This is my courtroom, not a public circus. I'll decide what's seen, and you'll sit down before you ruin yourself. His voice strained, a king shouting against a storm he couldn't stop, and the jury's doubt deepened. The single mother's grip tightened, her nails digging into her palms as she remembered the eviction notice she'd fought, a direct result of men like Blackwell and Grayson gaming the system. Karoline didn't yield. Ruin myself, she countered, her tone icy with conviction. The only thing ruined here is the myth of your integrity. The people deserve transparency. Let them watch and judge. She turned to the clerk, her voice steady but urgent. Please, set it up now. The clerk hesitated, glancing at Grayson, but the weight of her words and the eyes of the jury pushed him into action. Within minutes, technicians scrambled to link the courtroom feed to massive screens outside, where a growing crowd gathered, their faces flickering into view on a monitor near the bench. Grayson's breath hitched, his control slipping as the reality sank in. His every move was now a public spectacle. Blackwell, sensing the shift, leaned forward, his smugness fracturing into unease. He whispered sharply to his attorney, but his eyes stayed on Karoline, a predator cornered by prey he'd underestimated. She pressed on, flipping open the folder to reveal a second page, a bank statement tying Grayson's signature to a personal account that ballooned after the transfer. $4 million, she said, her voice rising with a fierce clarity, funneled through your hands, Your Honor, while families lost homes, schools crumbled and trust eroded. Deny that. The jury's faces hardened. The single mother's eyes brimming with tears, not of sorrow, but of a righteous anger she'd carried too long. Grayson's voice cracked as he tried to rally. This is a sham. You've doctored those papers. I'll have them thrown out and you with them. But his bluster faltered, drowned by the murmur of the crowd outside, their chants filtering through the walls. Truth, truth. The law students in the back stood, their notebooks forgotten, their fists raised in silent solidarity. Karoline met Grayson's glare, her words a final blow. Throw them out? You can't throw out what's already burning through this room, and beyond it. The people see you now, and they won't forget. The screens outside flared with her image, her voice echoing into the streets, a clarion call that shook the foundations of Grayson's reign. Victory wasn't hers yet, but it was close. So close she could feel its pulse, and the weight of a nation's eyes bore down on the man who'd thought he was untouchable. The courtroom teetered on the edge of chaos, Judge Leonard Grayson's voice rising in a frantic crescendo as he tried to claw back control. These documents are a sham, he shouted, his gavel slamming down with a force that rattled the bench. I'll have this entire proceeding dismissed, Leavitt. You've overplayed your hand. His words were a desperate shield, his face flushed with a mix of rage and fear, but the jury's eyes remained fixed on Karoline Leavitt, her calm defiance a stark contrast to his unraveling. She opened her mouth to respond, her next piece of evidence, a recorded phone call, already in hand, when the double doors at the back of the room exploded open with a thunderous bang. Pam Bondi strode in, a force of nature in a crisp black suit, her steps a storm breaking over the silence. Her blonde hair was pulled back tight, her eyes sharp and unyielding, cutting through the air like a blade. Behind her, 2 federal agents moved in lockstep, their dark uniforms a silent promise of consequence, handcuffs gleaming at their belts. The room froze, every head swiveling, every breath held as Bondi's voice rang out, cold and commanding. Judge Leonard Grayson, she declared, her tone a gavel of its own. Under my authority as United States Attorney General, you're under arrest for obstructing justice, conspiring to defraud the public, and abetting corruption. Your friends can't save you this time. The words landed like a lightning strike, a nod to the past Karoline had unearthed, and Grayson's jaw dropped, his gavel slipping from his grasp to clatter uselessly on the wood. He stumbled back, his hands grasping the edge of the bench as if it could anchor him against the tide. "This is outrageous," he sputtered, his voice a broken echo of its former thunder. "You can't do this. I demand an explanation." But Bondi didn't flinch. She advanced, her gaze locking onto his, silencing him with its icy weight. "You'll get your explanation in a cell, Grayson," she said, her words clipped and final. "Your signature's on a $4 million lie, and the people you swore to protect paid the price." The agents closed in, one seizing his arm while the other snapped the cuffs around his wrists. Grayson yanked against them, his robe tangling as he tried to cling to the bench, glaring at the screens broadcasting his downfall, powerless to stop the truth spilling out. The steel clicked shut, and his aura of power dissolved before hundreds of stunned eyes. Karoline stood still, her heart pounding with a fierce, triumphant rhythm. Ethan Blackwell at the defendant's table jolted upright, his smug grin replaced by a wild-eyed panic. "Wait," he blurted, his voice cracking as he turned to his attorney. "Pierce's testimony broke him first, and I'll give you everything, just don't—" His plea cut off as the attorney hissed something sharp, but the damage was done. The jury murmured, their faces alight with a mix of shock and vindication, while the screens outside flared with the scene unfolding within. A drone hovering above the courthouse captured it all. Grayson, head bowed, wrists bound, being led down the aisle. And within seconds, the footage hit social media, racing across platforms with the hashtag #JusticeRising. Comments flooded in. "Finally, someone pays!" "Leavitt and Bondi, heroes we need." Outside, the crowd swelled, their cheers erupting into a roar that shook the building's walls. Among them stood the Georgetown law students from earlier, their notebooks swapped for megaphones as they launched an impromptu forum on the courthouse steps. "This isn't the end," one shouted, her voice raw with passion. "It's the start. Reform starts with us." The words carried over the throng, igniting nods and raised fists, a generation stepping into the light. Karoline had sparked. But amid the jubilation, a quieter sound pierced through, a choked sob from an older man in a faded coat, his hands trembling as he clutched a photo of a house lost to Blackwell's sham projects. "I thought no one cared," he whispered, tears streaking his face. "Thank you." His gratitude was a thread of raw humanity, weaving into the crowd's fervor, a reminder of why this fight mattered. Inside, Bondi turned to Karoline, her stern mask softening for a fleeting moment. "You lit the fuse," she said, her voice low but warm. "I just brought the fire." Karoline nodded, a faint smile breaking through her composure. "We did it together," she replied, her tone steady but laced with pride. The agents hauled Grayson past her, his head hanging low, his eyes avoiding hers, presentment simmering in the slump of his shoulders. He muttered something under his breath, a last gasp of defiance, but it was swallowed by the crowd's chants echoing through the open doors. "Justice, justice." Blackwell slumped in his seat, his hands raking through his hair as the reality crashed down. "I'll name names," he stammered, his voice a plea to anyone listening. "I swear I'll—" Bondi cut him off with a raised hand, her eyes narrowing. "Save it for the feds, Blackwell. Your deals don't fly here." The jury watched, their expressions a gallery of awe and relief, while the law students outside kept the momentum alive, their voices rising in a call for a system that served the people, not the powerful. The drone footage looped online, each view a hammer blow to Grayson's reign, each share a testament to a tide turning. Karoline gathered her files, her hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through her. She glanced at the screens, catching a glimpse of the crowd, faces young and old, united in a hope she'd helped rekindle. Bondi stepped closer, her presence a rock amid the storm. "This is bigger than us," she said, her tone firm but electric with possibility. "You've given them something to believe in." The older man's sob echoed in Karoline's mind, a quiet fuel to the fire now blazing bright. The room buzzed with a victory hard won, a justice not just served but reclaimed, raw, real, and resonant. Outside, the cheers grew louder, the hashtag trended higher, and the students' voices soared, a chorus of a future unshackled from the past. Grayson's reign was over, Blackwell's empire in ruins, and Karoline Leavitt stood at the heart of it all, her fight a beacon for a nation ready to rise. The dust of the courtroom battle had barely settled when Karoline Leavitt received the call, a summons to the White House, delivered with the unmistakable urgency of a moment too big to delay. She stepped into the Oval Office, her pulse quickening as Donald Trump rose from behind the Resolute desk, his presence commanding, his eyes sharp with a rare warmth. "Karoline," he said, his voice deep and resonant, "you're a fire guiding this nation, unstoppable, unyielding. What you did out there? That's the America I fight for." He rounded the desk, a broad smile breaking across his face, and pinned a gleaming medal of valor to her jacket, a badge of honor for a warrior who'd toppled giants. "I'm giving you something bigger," he continued, his tone electric with conviction. "You'll lead a new national anti-corruption task force, root out the rot wherever it hides. You've got my full backing. Make it count." Karoline's breath caught, pride swelling in her chest, but before she could respond, her phone buzzed. A text from her mother Abigail. "Come home tonight. There's something you need to know." Hours later, in the soft glow of her suburban D.C. living room, Abigail sat across from her, her hands trembling as she spoke. "Years ago, when you were just a girl, I worked as a clerk in Grayson's court," she said, her voice thick with memory. "I saw him bury cases, honest people ruined by his greed. I spoke up, and he made sure I lost everything, my job, my savings. I never told you because I didn't want you to carry that weight, but today, Karoline, you fixed it. You avenged us all." Tears brimmed in Abigail's eyes, her pride a quiet storm, and Karoline's heart clenched. A victory once professional, now achingly personal, a circle closed by a daughter's courage. That night, fueled by her mother's revelation and Trump's charge, Karoline unveiled her next step. Standing before a small press corps, she announced Truth Beacon, a government-backed app empowering citizens to report corruption anonymously, a digital torch to pierce the shadows. "This isn't just my fight," she said, her voice steady but alive with passion. "It's ours. Every American who believes in justice, together we'll shine a light no one can extinguish." The room erupted in applause, the idea sparking a wave of hope, a tool for a nation ready to reclaim its trust. Later, on the White House balcony, Karoline stood alone, the cool night air brushing her face as she gazed over Washington's twinkling skyline. The weight of her new role settled on her shoulders, not a burden, but a mantle she was born to wear. Below, the city pulsed with possibility. A capital stirring from years of quiet betrayal. She thought of Abigail, whose sacrifice had unknowingly shaped her path, and of the countless others like that man outside the courthouse, his sobs still echoing in her soul. This was for them, for every voice silenced, every dream stolen. Inside, her 9-month-old son giggled in Abigail's arms, his laughter a melody of innocence and promise. Karoline turned, crossing back to them, and scooped him up, his warmth grounding her soaring spirit. "It's for you too," she whispered, kissing his forehead. Abigail smiled, her eyes glistening. "You're changing the world, Karoline." And as she held her son tight, the city sprawling beneath her, Karoline felt it, a fire rekindled, a mission just beginning, a future hers to forge. Karoline Leavitt's triumph over corruption teaches us a timeless truth. Courage, not power, reshapes the world. Facing Grayson's scorn and Blackwell's deceit, she didn't waver, she wielded evidence like a sword, proving that one voice, armed with resolve, can topple giants. Her victory, sealed by Pam Bondi's justice and deepened by Abigail's revelation, shows that standing up isn't just about winning, it's about healing wounds past and present for ourselves and others. In today's America, where trust frays and shadows loom, this lesson rings clear. Don't wait for permission to fight what's wrong. Speak out at work, in your community, or online. Use your phone, your vote, your truth. Like Karoline, build alliances, harness tools like Truth Beacon, and persist. Justice demands grit, not just hope. Love this story? Hit subscribe. Your support fuels more tales of heroes who dare to change the game.